On the morning of July 25th, 1944, a German soldier from the Panzer Lehr division was in a defensive position near the town of Saint-Lô in Normandy when the sound began. He described it afterward as starting like distant thunder, a low, continuous rumble from the west that grew over the course of several minutes, until it was not thunder anymore but something else entirely, something with no name in his experience of the war. Then the first wave of American bombers appeared. He wrote that he stopped counting after 300. There were more than 1,500. What followed was 40 minutes that erased the Panzer Lehr division as a fighting force. 4,000 tons of explosives fell on a 7-kilometer stretch of German line. General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer Lehr, described what he found afterward when he drove through his own positions. He called it a moonscape. His men had been buried alive in their foxholes. Tanks had been flipped onto their sides by the blast. Men who had survived without visible wounds could not speak, could not understand orders, could not function. They sat in the craters and waited for something that did not come, because there was nothing left to come. The defensive line that had held the Americans in the bocage for 6 weeks was gone, not broken, gone. Where Panzer Lehr had been there was now a strip of cratered ground 3 miles wide and open at both ends. One soldier from Panzer Lehr who survived the Cobra bombardment and was pulled out of a collapsed foxhole described the experience with a specificity that later accounts of the battle kept returning to. He said that the sound of a bomb landing at close range was not what he expected from the years of artillery he had heard. It did not arrive as a single sharp detonation but as a physical blow, a pressure wave that hit the entire body simultaneously, that seemed to compress the chest from both directions at once. He said that after the third wave he could no longer hear anything, that the silence inside his own head while the bombs continued to fall was more frightening than the noise had been. He said that when they dug him out, 3 men who had been in the foxhole with him were dead, and he did not know how he was alive, and neither did the men who dug him out. He said that after that day he stopped trying to explain survival in rational terms. Bayerlein drove through his positions after the bombardment and reported upward. He wrote that not a single tank was able to move. He wrote that the roads were cratered every few meters. He wrote that communications had been completely destroyed. He wrote that if the Americans attacked now immediately with what they had available, the Panzer Lehr division could not stop them. He was right. Patton's Third Army came through the gap on July 26th and the German army in Normandy began the process of dying. What happened in the 3 weeks between the Cobra breakthrough and the formation of the Falaise Pocket was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was the collapse of a strategic position that had been held for 6 weeks by men who had been fighting since June 6th, without reinforcement, without rest, without the fuel or the ammunition to conduct the mobile defensive operations that German doctrine prescribed and German soldiers understood. The Normandy campaign by late July was being fought by formations that had been bled below the point where most armies would have stopped calling them formations. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, the boys who had been 17 when they arrived in Normandy and had been killing Allied soldiers with a ferocity that shocked everyone including themselves, was down to a fraction of its original strength. Das Reich, Leibstandarte, the conventional Wehrmacht Panzer divisions, all of them had been committing their last reserves since July. The men holding the hedgerows in the weeks before Cobra were not simply fighting. They were fighting while running out of everything that fighting requires, and they knew it. And they kept going because stopping was not a category that their training had a procedure for. The German army had survived encirclements before. The specific tactical doctrine for breaking out of a pocket, keeping communications open, identifying the weakest point in the enemy ring, concentrating whatever mobile forces remained and driving through, had been developed and refined through 3 years of Eastern Front fighting. Every officer in France in August 1944 had either used it himself or served under commanders who had. What they did not have a doctrine for was an encirclement that formed while they were already running out of fuel. Breaking out of a pocket requires tanks that can move. Tanks that can move require fuel. The German army in the Falaise Pocket in August 1944 was attempting to execute a doctrine that assumed a resource it did not have. Patton's armoured columns drove west into Brittany, then pivoted south, then swung east at a pace that German headquarters could not track. One German officer from the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich described the period between the Cobra breakthrough and the formation of the pocket as a situation where the strategic picture had stopped making sense. He said that for the first 2 days after the breakthrough, he kept receiving orders that bore no relationship to the actual positions of the forces around him. He said he eventually stopped reporting his position accurately because accurate reporting produced orders to hold positions that no longer existed or to attack in directions where there was nothing to attack. He said he began making decisions based on what he could see and hear rather than what the maps showed, because the maps no longer corresponded to anything real. Hitler's response to the encirclement taking shape was the same response he had given to every encirclement since Stalingrad. Hold. Attack west. Restore the line. Operation Luttich, launched on August 7th, committed 4 panzer divisions including Leibstandarte in an attack toward Avranches, driving directly back toward the coast where Patton had first broken through. The logic was not irrational in isolation. If the German armour could reach the coast and cut off Patton's supply lines, the American forces that had passed through the gap would be isolated. What the logic did not account for was that Allied fighter bombers were in the air over every German armoured formation at every hour of daylight, and that the American units holding Mortain had been told to hold the high ground regardless of what happened around them, and that telling American infantry to hold ground they have been ordered to hold is a sentence with a specific meaning that the German army in 1944 had not yet fully absorbed. One American soldier from a unit holding the ridge at Mortain during the Luttich counterattack wrote about the experience with the directness of a man describing something that he survived, but that many men around him did not. He said that the first day of the German attack came from 3 directions simultaneously and that the noise never stopped from any direction at any time, and that the effect of continuous noise from 3 directions on men who had been in combat for 2 months was something he did not have adequate language to describe to someone who had not been there. He said that at various points during the first night he was not certain that the position was still held because he could not get communications in any direction and could only hear German voices in the dark. He said that by dawn on the second day he had been told that the position was still held, and he had looked at the men around him and believed it because they were still there, and that was all the evidence available. The 30th Infantry Division held its positions. The Panzer assault stalled. The counterattack that was supposed to restore the German line in Normandy drove the German armour deeper into the pocket forming around it. By August 12th, the trap had its shape. The American 15th Corps under General Wade Heislip had driven north and reached Argentan. The Canadians were 12 miles away, driving south from Falaise. The gap between the 2 jaws was 12 miles wide. Heislip was ready to push north. Bradley told him to stop, and the decision was not irrational. Bradley's intelligence estimated 19 German divisions moving toward the gap. Heislip's corps had been advancing with its left flank exposed. If the German forces inside converged on that flank while the gap was being closed, an American corps could be destroyed. Bradley said, "I much preferred a solid shoulder at Argentan to the possibility of a broken neck at Falaise." Patton wrote in his diary that Heislip could easily advance to Falaise and completely close the gap. He called the halt a great mistake. One officer present at Patton's headquarters when the order arrived described what happened in that room with enough specificity to make clear it was not a quiet conversation. He said that Patton's response made his view of the decision unmistakable to everyone present, and that the thing that stayed with him was not the anger, but the certainty. Patton was completely certain he was right, certain in a way that did not allow for the possibility of error, and the certainty was worse than the anger, because certainty of that kind in a general usually means he is correct. 3 days later, a fighter pilot flying patrol over the gap radioed back to base. The whole goddamn German army was moving through the gap. Inside the pocket, the situation by mid-August was not a battle anymore. It was a disaster being managed in real time by men whose skill and experience could slow the rate of collapse but could not reverse it. Paul Hauser, SS General, 58 years old, the man who had defied Hitler at Kharkov and saved the SS Panzer Corps from a second Stalingrad, commanded the 7th Army inside the pocket. His headquarters moved 3 times in 4 days as Allied pressure closed in from all sides. His communications were intermittently functional. His formations were reporting positions that the following day's map would show as already overrun. One soldier from inside the pocket, crossing the corridor in the 3rd week of August, described the road with a specificity that appeared in every subsequent history of the battle that used soldier testimony. He said he had fought on the Eastern Front for 2 years and had seen things he believed could not be exceeded in horror. The road through the Falaise corridor exceeded them. The vehicles were piled on both sides where they had been hit or had broken down and been pushed to the shoulders. Between the vehicles were the horses, dead in the traces or standing wounded and unable to move. Between the horses were the men. The dead lay where they had fallen. The wounded lay beside the dead, because there was nowhere else for them and no one could stop to move them. The living moved east in a stream that was continuous and did not pause. He said the smell in August heat was something he had never found words for in the decades since. He said the flies were so thick on the dead that from a distance the bodies appeared to move. An Australian Typhoon pilot flew sorties over the corridor during these days. He described his attacks with a matter-of-fact precision that made what he was describing worse than any dramatic account could have managed. He said, "We let our rockets go, and then we fired separately at the packed crowd of soldiers. We started firing, then slowly drew the cannon fire through the crowd, and then we took off and made one round after another until we ran out of ammunition. After each round, which led to a large empty path with fallen soldiers, the space was almost immediately filled by other fleeing soldiers." General Luttich of the 2nd Panzer Division drove through his own positions inside the pocket and described what he saw in a phrase that subsequent accounts kept using, because nothing else described it as accurately. He said, "Mountains of vehicles, dead horses and dead soldiers were scattered over the road, and they increased in number by the hour." Hauser was trying to get his men out, but the corridor was narrowing and Allied aircraft were over it every hour of daylight. One German officer from a Panzer division described the mathematics of his unit's situation with a flatness that conveyed the reality more clearly than any emotional account. He said his division had started the Normandy campaign with over 150 tanks. When they began crossing the corridor, they had 14. Those 14 were not at full crew strength. Some had 3 men, some had 2. The fuel was not calculated in terms of how far they could go, but whether they could start. He said they crossed the corridor in darkness, moving no faster than the men walking beside the tanks, and when his tank ran out of fuel 2 miles east of the corridor, he ordered it destroyed, and the crew walked the rest of the way to the Seine on foot. One soldier from an SS division who reached the Seine after the crossing described finding a row of Panthers on a road east of the pocket, the most capable medium tank in the German arsenal, guns loaded, engines cold, hatches open, no one inside. He said he stopped and looked at them. He said it was at that moment, and not before, that he understood the war was finished. He kept walking east. Field Marshal von Kluge vanished for several hours on August 15th. He had driven into an area where Allied aircraft were active and lost communications with headquarters. Hitler, already suspicious of his possible involvement in the July 20th assassination attempt, interpreted the disappearance as a secret contact with the Allies. Von Kluge was relieved and ordered to Berlin. He wrote Hitler a letter urging him to end the war, took a cyanide capsule in the back of his staff car, and was found dead before he reached the border. Model replaced him and immediately organised the one operation that might salvage something, an assault on the hill that was acting as a cork in the bottle of the German escape. General Stanisław Maciek commanded the Polish 1st Armoured Division. He had fought since September 1939, in Poland, in France, in the evacuation to Britain, in 4 years of preparation before Normandy. His men had landed on D-Day plus 57, the same day the Warsaw Uprising began in German-occupied Poland. They had come ashore knowing what was happening at home and being unable to do anything about it. They had been fighting the 12th SS Hitlerjugend in the approach to Falaise for a week, taking casualties from boys who were almost young enough to be their sons, and who fought with the specific ferocity of men who had been told since childhood that dying for a cause was the highest possible expression of human existence. One soldier from the Polish 1st Armoured, who had been fighting toward Falaise through the 2nd week of August, described the Hitlerjugend in terms that gave credit where it was owed by a man who had every reason to give none. He said that the 12th SS should not have been capable of what they were still doing in those days. He said that they had been in continuous combat since June, had lost most of their tanks, most of their officers, most of their ammunition. He said that in spite of all of this, they kept fighting with an intensity that seemed to increase, rather than decrease as their situation worsened. He said he did not understand it, and had never understood it, and that not understanding it had not made fighting them any easier. On August 19th, one of Maciek's battle groups under Lieutenant Colonel Zgorzelski took a wrong route while manoeuvring toward their assigned objective, and ended up approaching the Mont-Ormel ridge from the east. Maciek looked at the map and understood immediately. His men had accidentally occupied the most important piece of ground in the entire battle. The Mont-Ormel ridge, hill 262, rose 262 metres above the corridor the German army was using to escape. The road passed directly below the summit in some places less than 200 meters away. Every vehicle, every man attempting to escape the pocket had to pass beneath whoever held the ridge. Maczek named it the Makzuga, the mace. Its profile on the map resembled a medieval weapon, and the name was accurate in every sense. He ordered his men to dig in. They were cut off. The Canadians had not reached Chambois below them. The Germans were moving past on three sides. 1,500 Polish soldiers were sitting on a hill surrounded by the remnants of 20 German divisions trying to escape. One Polish soldier on Hill 262 on the night of August 19th described lying in his position and looking down at the column below. He said he could not see individual men but could see the mass of the movement, thousands of soldiers, horses, vehicles, all moving east in a stream that did not stop. He could hear German voices in the dark at distances where a grenade throw was entirely possible. He said his orders were to hold his position and direct artillery fire onto the road, and that this is what he did. He said he did not spend time thinking about anything except the next fire mission and the one after that. August 20th, Model ordered simultaneous attacks from inside and outside the pocket. Das Reich and Hohenstaufen drove at Hill 262 from the east. The formation still inside the pocket attacked from the west. The Poles on the summit were to be overwhelmed, the corridor opened fully, and as many men as possible extracted before the Allies sealed the gap. The fighting on the slopes of Hill 262 on August 20th lasted the entire day without pause. Maczek wrote afterward, "In tank-to-tank combat, to every German tank we disabled, we lost 3 machines. This was caused by the enemy's access to good positions in terrain difficult for tank assault. Our losses were also due to the great advantage of the Panthers and Tigers in both armour and armour-piercing firepower over Shermans." His men were fighting Panthers and Tigers with Shermans on a hillside, where the German tanks had the terrain advantage. One Polish soldier on the ridge described watching 3 tanks from his regiment burn on the slope during the morning, and said that by the afternoon he had stopped counting, because counting was not useful, and there were other things to do. He said they fired until they were almost out of ammunition. He said they called for resupply, and it did not come. He said they called for relief, and it did not come. He said they kept firing. One German soldier from Das Reich, attacking Hill 262 from the east on August 20th, described the approach to the ridge with the specific texture of a man who had made many attacks and knew what a well-prepared defensive position felt like when you were advancing toward it. He said that the Polish positions were invisible from the approaches. They had dug in properly, had used the terrain, had positioned their anti-tank guns, where the tanks could not see them until the range was already dangerous. He said that the first indication that the position was occupied was usually a tank in front of him stopping and beginning to burn. He said they kept attacking because they had to keep attacking and the men behind him were depending on the corridor being opened. He said they did not open it enough. The German attacks forced a narrow gap past the Makzuga, not wide enough to save the bulk of the pocket, but enough for tens of thousands of men to filter through during the night of August 20th to 21st. Among them were the officers and NCOs who would appear at Arnhem 6 weeks later, and in the Ardennes 4 months after that. At Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive is the village directly below Hill 262, where the German columns were crossing the Dives River. Major David Curry of the South Alberta Regiment held his position for over 24 consecutive hours. His squadron was massively outnumbered. He knocked out a Tiger tank personally. His men killed or wounded over 300 Germans and captured 2,100. One of his soldiers described Curry during those hours with a sentence that has been quoted in every account of the battle since. "We knew at one stage that it was going to be a fight to the finish, but he was so cool about it, it was impossible for us to get excited." Curry received the Victoria Cross. On August 21st, Canadians broke through to relieve the Poles on Hill 262. What they found was a position that had held against 20 divisions for 2 days. Polish casualties, 351, killed or wounded, 11 tanks. German casualties around the Makzuga, approximately 1,500 killed or wounded, 5,000 captured, 55 tanks destroyed. By August 22nd, the pocket was sealed. Between 20,000 and 50,000 Germans had escaped. The range is enormous because the chaos made precision impossible. What did not escape was the capacity for large-scale operations. Approximately 10,000 to 15,000 Germans were killed inside the pocket. Between 40,000 and 50,000 captured. 500 tanks destroyed or abandoned, 3 German generals captured. One field marshal dead in his staff car. Eisenhower drove through the aftermath. He wrote that it was possible to walk for hundreds of yards stepping only on corpses. One American soldier who passed through the corridor after it closed wrote that he had been in combat since June and thought he knew what a battlefield smelled like. He said he did not know until August in the Falaise corridor. He said he could not eat for 3 days. He said the smell stayed in his clothes for a week, and that when he smelled it on himself, he understood for the first time what a complete military defeat meant in physical terms. Hauser crossed the corridor on foot. He had been wounded in the jaw by a shell fragment during the crossing. He was seen by several men helping others who had been hit worse than him to keep moving east. He made it out. He was tried at Nuremberg, convicted, released, and died in West Germany in 1972. The men who escaped the pocket rebuilt and fought again. Hohenstaufen appeared at Arnhem in September and destroyed the British 1st Airborne. Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Hitlerjugend appeared in the Ardennes in December. The Battle of the Bulge, 80,000 American casualties, the largest and costliest American battle of the entire war, was fought largely by men who had walked out of the Falaise corridor on foot in August, had abandoned their tanks on French roads, and had been given new tanks 3 months later. One American soldier who met SS armour in the Ardennes in December described the experience with a directness that captured the specific shock of encountering a force that should not still exist. He said they had been told the Germans were finished, that the Ardennes attack was a last desperate gasp, that it would be over quickly. He said that when the first SS Panzers appeared and his unit's anti-tank guns bounced rounds off the frontal armour, his understanding of what finished meant changed permanently. He said they fought like men who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. He said that in 6 months of fighting he had not encountered anything that fought like that, and he hoped he would not again. The war in the West continued until May 8, 1945, 9 months after Falaise. Bradley defended his decision to stop Patton for the rest of his life. He said the shoulder at Argentan was the right call. Patton never changed his view that it was a great mistake. The argument between them, and between their defenders and critics in the decades since, has never been resolved and probably cannot be, because the counterfactual cannot be tested. What Haislip's Corps would have done if it had pushed north of Argentan on August 12th is a question that has no definitive answer. What does have a definitive answer is the number, 12 miles. The gap was 12 miles. The forces capable of closing it were 12 miles away. They were told to stop. Maciek never lost a battle. After the war, the British government stripped him of his citizenship because his insistence on recognising the Polish government in exile rather than the Soviet-installed regime in Warsaw was politically inconvenient. He worked as a barman in Edinburgh. He received back his citizenship and his rank late in his life. He died in 1994, aged 92. The hill he held is called the Makzuga. The Poles who died there are buried on the ridge. Below the monument, the road the German army tried to escape through is a country lane in Normandy that looks like nothing in particular. One Polish soldier from the 1st Armoured Division wrote about Hill 262 many years later. He said that he had fought since September 1939, across 4 countries, and that at every stage he had believed he was fighting toward something, toward the moment when Poland would be free. He said that on the hill, looking down at the German army passing below him in the dark, he believed that moment was close. He was right about the change. He was wrong about going home. Poland did not become free when the war ended. It became Soviet. He did not return for 45 years. This is the Falaise Pocket. The trap that almost worked. The 12 miles that cost the war 6 months. The hill that held. The specific quality of the fighting inside the pocket during its final days deserves more attention than most accounts give it. The men inside were not simply running. Many of them were fighting rearguard actions that delayed the pocket's closure and kept the corridor open longer than Allied commanders had calculated. The 12th SS Hitlerjugend, tasked with holding the northern shoulder of the corridor, had by August 17th been reduced to a force that bore no statistical relationship to a division. Its tanks were in the single digits. Its infantry strength was a fraction of what it had been in June. Its officers, many of whom had been leading men in continuous combat since D-Day, were in some cases replacements for replacements. Men who had taken command of companies when the previous commander was killed, and who had themselves been replaced when they were killed, men whose connection to the unit's institutional memory extended back 3 weeks. One soldier from the 12th SS who was holding positions on the northern shoulder of the corridor in the 3rd week of August described what the unit looked like by that stage of the campaign with a flatness that conveyed the reality more precisely than any emotional account. He said that his platoon had started Normandy with 34 men, When he took position on the northern shoulder, his platoon numbered 8. He said that of those 8, 3 had wounds that would have required hospitalization at any earlier stage of the war, but that there was no rear area to send them to, and they were still functional enough to hold a weapon. He said they held their position. He said the Canadians attacked their position twice on August 17th and twice they held. He said that the third time the Canadians attacked, he was in a different position because the first position no longer existed. The Canadians attacking the Hitlerjugend positions in those days were themselves not operating from a position of comfortable superiority. The losses in Operation Totalize and Operation Tractable, the 2 successive Canadian offensives that drove toward Falaise from the north, had been severe. Allied bombers had mistakenly bombed Canadian and Polish troops during the Tractable opening, inflicting 400 casualties on the forces that were supposed to be closing the pocket. Canadian armour was learning in the specific brutal classroom of combat against experienced German defenders that tank design and tactical training were 2 different problems, and that having the better tank in many situations was less important than having the crew that knew how to use the terrain. One Canadian tank commander from the advance on Falaise described the fighting against the Hitlerjugend positions with the specific respect that fighting men develop for opponents who make killing them expensive. He said that every position they had to take cost more than the position before it, which should not have been possible given the state the Germans were in, and that the explanation for this was not that the Germans had more men or better equipment, but that the men they had left were the ones who had survived everything that had been thrown at them since June and who had developed a specific relationship with combat that made them extraordinarily difficult to dislodge even when outnumbered, outgunned, and with no prospect of relief or reinforcement. The corridor itself, during the days it stayed open, was not simply a road through which men walked east. It was a killing zone that the Germans had to keep functional, and the Allies had to collapse, and the fighting on its edges was as brutal as anything in the Normandy campaign. At Chambois, the junction where American and Polish forces were supposed to link up and seal the pocket from the south, the fighting on August 19th and 20th produced one of the most chaotic engagements of the entire campaign. American forces from the 90th Infantry Division had reached Chambois. Polish forces from the 1st Armoured were approaching from the north. German forces trying to escape the pocket were attacking through both of them simultaneously, trying to keep the crossing points over the Dives River open long enough for the men still inside to get through. One American soldier from the 90th Infantry Division who was in Chambois during the link-up described the experience with a specificity that made clear he was describing something that had no clean operational narrative. He said that by the morning of August 20th he could not always identify which direction fire was coming from, because there were German forces between his unit and the Poles, German forces between his unit and the other American elements, and German forces trying to break through from the pocket simultaneously. He said that the principle of identifying your target before firing is entirely correct as a principle, and that in Chambois on August 20th it was not always possible to apply it without being killed while you were applying it. The link-up between American and Polish forces at Chambois on August 19th was a moment that the official histories of the campaign treated as a triumph, and that the men involved described with more ambivalence. The pocket was not sealed when the 2 forces met. The Germans were still forcing men through whatever gaps remained, and the 2 Allied forces that had just linked up did not have sufficient strength at the junction point to close those gaps completely. The photographs of the link-up show soldiers shaking hands in the street of a village that was still being shelled. One Polish officer at the Chambois link-up described the handshake with his American counterpart as happening while both of them were pressed against a wall, waiting for the artillery to stop, which it did not, and that the symbolic significance of the moment was somewhat reduced by the practical requirement of not being killed during it. The pocket's final days produced the specific kind of fighting that has no heroic narrative available to it. Men trying to get through a shrinking space, men trying to stop them, both sides taking casualties at rates that their original formations could not have absorbed, without ceasing to exist, and that the remnants now absorbed because the remnants were by definition the men who absorbed things. The distinction between a fighting unit and a desperate mob trying to escape is not always clear when the unit is fighting desperately to escape, and the accounts from both sides of the Falaise corridor during those final days are filled with the specific moral ambiguity of men doing what survival required in a landscape that no longer had a stable geography of who was where. What the pocket produced in its aftermath was a road that Eisenhower described as one of the greatest killing grounds of the entire war. He wrote that it was possible to walk for hundreds of yards stepping only on dead men and dead horses. Allied soldiers who were detailed to clear the corridor after it closed described the work in terms that most of them did not volunteer for subsequent discussions. The August heat accelerated decomposition. The scale of the dead, military estimates put the number of corpses in the corridor at somewhere between 10 and 15,000, made individual treatment of the dead impossible. The horses were an additional problem that no planning document had anticipated. The German army had brought thousands of draft animals into the pocket, and those animals had died where they were when the ammunition ran out or the formations collapsed around them. The specific smell of the Falaise corridor in late August 1944 appeared in the accounts of every soldier who passed through it. None of them had a word for it that was adequate. They all had a memory of it that was permanent. The accounting of what escaped and what did not has been argued over in the historiography of the campaign for 80 years, primarily because both sides had reasons to adjust the figures. The Germans wanted to minimise the scale of the disaster. The Allies wanted to maximise the scale of the victory. The range of estimates, 20,000 to 50,000 escaped, 40,000 to 50,000 captured, 10,000 to 15,000 killed, reflects the genuine impossibility of counting men who crossed a corridor under artillery fire in darkness and arrived at the Seine in small groups over several days. What is not in dispute is that the men who escaped were disproportionately the experienced combat soldiers of the SS Panzer divisions and the better Wehrmacht formations, the men who had the training and the unit cohesion to organise breakout attempts, to move at night, to find the gaps in the Allied ring. The men who were captured in largest numbers were the support troops, the Luftwaffe ground crews, the artillery units that had lost their guns, formations that had combat power in specific contexts and none at all in the context of a cross-country escape through Allied lines. The experienced men who escaped would fight again. This is the fact that turns Falaise from a complete victory into the incomplete victory that historians have been debating ever since. There is one final detail that belongs here. The Panzer soldier who survived the Cobra bombardment, the man who stopped counting bombers after 300, who was buried in his foxhole and dug out by men who could not explain why he was alive, survived the entire war. He crossed the Falaise corridor on foot in August 1944. He fought in the retreat through France and Belgium. He fought in the Ardennes in December. He crossed the Rhine in March 1945. He surrendered in May. He went home to what remained of Germany and rebuilt a life in the rubble. He had been bombed in Normandy, encircled in the pocket and shelled in the corridor, and he had walked out of all of it. He wrote about Falaise because it was the moment he understood that the outcome of the war had been decided, not on the day Germany surrendered, but in the cratered fields outside St. Lo on July 25th, when 1,500 bombers appeared in the sky and the line simply ceased to exist. Everything after that was the working out of a conclusion already reached. The Falaise Pocket was where it became undeniable. The 12 miles was where it could still have been closed earlier. The hill was where 1,500 Polish soldiers who had been fighting since 1939 held the door almost shut. Almost. The men who escaped the Falaise Pocket and rebuilt in the autumn of 1944 were not simply survivors. They were the distillation of what 4 years of continuous war had produced. The specific subset of men from each formation who had absorbed every tactical lesson available, who had developed an instinctive understanding of how to keep themselves alive in situations that were supposed to be unsurvivable, and who carried that understanding into the Ardennes and beyond. When the Hitler Jugend appeared in the Ardennes with new recruits filling the ranks, those recruits were being led by NCOs and officers who had been in the 12th SS since Normandy, who had been in the pocket, who had walked out of the corridor, and who had a relationship with combat that no amount of training could replicate. The new men fought alongside the veterans, and the veterans showed them what 4 years of war had taught, and the result was a formation that should not have been capable of what it did in December and January, and which was capable of it anyway because of the men who had escaped through a 12-mile gap in August. One veteran of the Ardennes fighting, an American officer who had also been in Normandy, described the specific quality he encountered in the SS formations he faced in Belgium with a precision that cut through retrospective analysis. He said that the characteristic that distinguished the SS veterans in December 1944 from what he had expected was not ferocity, which he had been briefed to expect, and not tactical skill, which he could observe. It was patience. He said they were patient in a way that indicated they had been in situations this bad before and worse, and that patience in an opponent in that condition was more dangerous than anything else because it meant they were waiting for the mistake rather than making mistakes themselves. He was describing men who had survived the Falaise Pocket, Men who had learned patience in a corridor where impatience killed you. Men who carried that lesson to Belgium in December and applied it to Americans who had been told the war was almost over. The war was not almost over. It would continue until May 1945. The 12 miles that stayed open in August 1944 are part of why.